On a spring morning in April 1947, a Japanese general was dragged off a truck by two military policemen. His legs had given out beneath him. Thousands of Chinese civilians packed the hillside around him, screaming for revenge. 10 years earlier, this same man had marched his soldiers through the gates of a fallen city and unleashed 6 weeks of slaughter that would leave the world horrified for generations. Now, standing on a slope overlooking the very city his troops had destroyed, he was about to pay for it with a single bullet to the back of the head. This is the story of Lieutenant General Hisao Tani, the commander who helped orchestrate one of the darkest chapters in modern history, and the day China finally made him answer for it. Hisao Tani was born on December 22, 1882, into a farming family in Okayama Prefecture, Japan. Like many young men who would go on to lead Imperial Japan's military machine, Tani's path to power began at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. He entered the academy's 15th class and graduated in 1903, finishing 16th in his class, a respectable if not spectacular start to a career that would eventually place him in command of thousands of men. Tani's early service came during the Russo-Japanese War, where he saw combat as a second lieutenant attached to the Guard's 1st Infantry Battalion, despite having trained primarily in artillery. He survived the brutal fighting of that war, unlike some of his own academy classmates, and returned to continue climbing the ranks of the Japanese military establishment. His education didn't stop there. In 1912, Tani graduated third in his class from the Army War College, a credential that marked him as a rising star within the Imperial Japanese Army. Over the following 2 decades, Tani would steadily advance through the officer corps, absorbing the doctrines, discipline, and ideology of a military that was rapidly expanding its ambitions across Asia. By the 1930s, Japan's imperial machine was on the move. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 had already signaled Tokyo's intentions on the Asian mainland, and by July 1937, a clash at the Marco Polo Bridge ignited the full-scale Second Sino-Japanese War. It was in this new, brutal phase of Japanese expansion that Hisao Tani would find the command that defined and ultimately ended his life. Tani took command of the Imperial Japanese Army's 6th Division, a unit that would become deeply entangled in some of the most infamous atrocities of the war. His division fought through northern and central China, contributing to major operations including actions along the Beiping-Hankou and Tianjin-Pukou railway corridors, and later joining the assault on Shanghai during the Second Battle of Shanghai, a campaign that foreshadowed the horror still to come. As Japanese forces pushed westward following the fall of Shanghai, Tani's 6th Division joined the 18th and 114th Divisions in a converging assault on China's capital city, Nanjing. What followed would not just define Tani's legacy, it would become one of the most notorious war crimes of the 20th century. In December 1937, Japanese forces closed in on Nanjing, then the capital of China. The city's defenders were outnumbered and outgunned, and within days the outer defenses began to collapse under the weight of the assault. As commander of the 6th Division, Hisao Tani's troops were among the very first to breach the city's walls and enter its streets. What happened next has come to be known around the world as the Nanjing Massacre, or the Rape of Nanking. For approximately 6 weeks beginning December 13, 1937, Japanese soldiers unleashed a campaign of violence almost impossible to comprehend. Mass executions swept through the city. Prisoners of war were rounded up and systematically killed, sometimes under the pretext that there weren't enough rations to feed them. Women were assaulted on a horrifying scale, with historians describing tens of thousands of rapes. Homes were looted and burned. Entire families were wiped out. Historians estimate the death toll ranged as high as 300,000 civilians and disarmed soldiers, though the exact number remains debated to this day. The violence was not confined to a single method. Survivors and researchers have documented mass shootings, live burials, bayoneting, arson, and drowning, a level of brutality that shocked even hardened observers inside the city, including foreign nationals who had set up a Nanking safety zone in an attempt to shelter civilians from the slaughter. No single written order authorizing this indiscriminate killing has ever been found, but historians agree that senior Japanese command made a clear and repeated choice not to stop it. Whatever discipline existed among the officer corps broke down almost entirely once the city fell, and it was units like Tani's 6th Division that were on the ground carrying it out. After the massacre, Tani's division was withdrawn back to Japan by the end of 1937. Tani himself went on to hold the position of commander of the Central District Army until September 1939, when he entered the reserves, his direct role in frontline combat seemingly finished. But the war was not. Even in reserve status, Tani wasn't finished serving the empire. After the atomic bombing of Hiroshima in August 1945, with Japan's military collapsing and an Allied invasion looking increasingly likely, Tani was recalled to active duty. He was placed in command of the 59th Army and simultaneously the Chugoku Regional Army District, hastily assembled forces made up largely of poorly trained reservists, conscripted students, and Home Guard militia, tasked with defending Western Honshu against a possible Allied landing. That invasion never came. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, and the 59th Army was formally demobilized. For a brief moment, it may have seemed like Hisao Tani's wartime story was simply over, a soldier who had served, retired, and briefly resurfaced before Japan's final collapse. It wasn't over, not even close. In February 1946, American occupation authorities arrested Tani and charged him with Class B and Class C war crimes. But it wasn't the Americans who would ultimately try him. At the request of the Chinese government, Tani was extradited to China to stand trial before the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal, a court established specifically to prosecute Imperial Japanese officers for crimes committed during the war. The proceedings began in August 1946. Tani denied every charge against him. He argued that his troops had maintained discipline and that the section of Nanjing assigned to his division had largely been evacuated ahead of the fighting due to how fierce the battle had become. His defense pointed out that none of the witnesses testifying against him could specifically identify his unit by number, and that much of the evidence presented actually pointed toward soldiers under different commanders, namely Generals Keseigo Nakajima and Shigeharu Sumatsu. It was, in some ways, a reasonable defense on paper, but the presiding judge wasn't interested in dividing up blame between units. Tani's request to call his own chief of staff and surviving junior officers as witnesses was denied. The court's position was blunt. With hundreds of surviving witnesses, along with testimony from foreign nationals who had lived through the massacre inside the Nanking safety zone, there was no reasonable way to carve out individual innocence from collective atrocity. The tribunal ruled that all senior Japanese commanders present during the assault on Nanjing, including Generals Iwin Matsui, Haisuke Yanagawa, and Sadao Ushijima, along with Nakajima, Sumatsu, and Tani himself, bore equal shared responsibility for the horror that unfolded. Adding weight to the case against him, investigators reportedly used a reel of film showing Tani present at a mass execution site in China. Whatever his legal arguments, the visual evidence tying him to the killing helped seal the tribunal's judgment. Critics have since noted the trial itself was fast-moving and by some accounts imperfectly conducted. But for a nation still reeling from what had happened in its former capital, due process was not the priority. Accountability was. In March 1947, Hisao Tani was found guilty and sentenced to death as a Class B and C war criminal. Before the sentencing, he had stood public trial at the Lejish Auditorium in Nanjing, in front of a courtroom in a city still carrying the scars of what his division had done a decade earlier. He attempted one final appeal. It was personally rejected by Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek, reportedly the day before Tani's scheduled execution. There would be no reprieve. On the morning of April 26, 1947, Hisao Tani prepared for the end. According to accounts passed down by witnesses, he clipped his fingernails and cut 3 strands of his hair that morning, placing them inside a handkerchief pouch so they could eventually be returned to Japan for burial. Before he was taken to the execution ground, he composed a short poem reflecting on his death, his parting from his wife, and a wish that the hatred between China and Japan might one day fade. He was loaded onto an open-top truck and driven through the streets of Nanjing toward Yuhuarai, a hillside execution ground on the edge of the city. The route was lined with massive crowds. People ran alongside the truck just to catch a glimpse of him. According to those who witnessed it, Tani was frail enough by that point that military police had to help carry him toward the execution site itself. He was positioned facing north toward the city his troops had once torn apart. He was not bound, and there were no markers or signs at the site. Witnesses who were present that day later recalled that he barely had time to take a few steps into the execution area before a single shot rang out from behind him, a handgun, fired once into the back of his head. He died instantly. The crowd's reaction was immediate and unrestrained. Survivors of the Nanjing Massacre who had gathered to watch erupted into cheers, some shouting words to the effect of revenge and declaring that even the Japanese now knew what judgment felt like. For a city that had endured 6 weeks of unimaginable horror a decade earlier, the execution of Hisao Tani offered something rare, a visible physical moment of accountability. Afterward, local constables tied his arms and legs, secured his body to a bamboo pole, and carried him away to be buried. Of all the senior Japanese officers connected to the Nanjing Massacre, remarkably few ever faced justice. Commander Iwin Matsui was tried and executed by the International Tribunal in Tokyo. Prince Yasuhiko Osaka, a member of the imperial family believed by many historians to have effectively authorized the indiscriminate killing, was granted immunity by General Douglas MacArthur as part of a broader strategy to protect the imperial family and secure a stable post-war Japan. Several other commanders had already died by the time trials took place. In the end, Hisao Tani stood as essentially the only general held directly accountable by a Chinese court on Chinese soil in front of the very people his division had devastated. His case remains one of the clearest examples of post-war justice carried out not by the victorious Allied powers, but by the nation that had suffered the atrocity firsthand. It's a story that raises uncomfortable but necessary questions that still echo today, about command responsibility, about the uneven and often selective nature of post-war justice, and about how a single officer can become the face of a crime carried out by thousands of soldiers under multiple commands. It's also worth remembering that the Nanjing War Crimes Tribunal didn't stop with Tani. Other officers connected to the massacre, including those tied to the infamous killing contest between two Japanese lieutenants, were later tried and executed as well. But none of those cases carried quite the same symbolic weight as watching a division commander marched up a hillside in the very city his troops had once terrorized. The execution of Hisao Tani didn't undo what happened in Nanjing. Nothing could. But for the survivors who stood on that hillside in April 1947, watching the man responsible finally answer for it, it was as close to justice as history would allow. If you want to understand how the 20th century's darkest chapters actually unfolded, not the sanitized textbook version, but the real events, real trials, and real consequences, make sure you subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the next story. And if this video taught you something new, drop a comment below and let me know what part of Hisao Tani's story struck you the most. Thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one.